elite class, according to Hoover Institution fellow David Satter. His new book, Darkness at Dawn, finds rampant corruption in this transition from totalitarian communism to democratic capitalism. The program's 1 hour.
We all know that after the terrorist attack on September 11th, the first person to offer his condolences to the United States was Vladimir Putin. And one of the points that Putin made was that Russians can well understand the feelings of Americans because they themselves were the victims of a terrorist attack. In Russia, the terrorist attack that he was referring to is well known. It was the bombings of the apartment buildings in Moscow, Volgodonsk, and Buynaksk in September 1999. Those bombings were attributed to Chechens and Chechen terrorists and were the pretext for the launching of the Second Chechen War, a war which continues to this day. But the question arises, what if the terrorist attack that Putin was referring to was not carried out by Chechens, but on the contrary was carried out by elements of the Russian government itself? Under those circumstances, how do we evaluate the professions of solidarity from the Russian leadership? And what does it mean about the future of Russia itself? The book that I've written attempts to describe the well-founded doubts about the provenance of those bombings and to show the evidence that, in fact, they were carried out not by Chechens, not by enemies of the state, but rather by agents of the state. But to understand how such a situation could have come about, it's necessary to take a detour through the history of the last 12 years. Because this was the period during which Russia left totalitarianism and was supposedly on its way to creating a viable and prosperous democracy. It was the great hope of the United States, and it was a focus of American foreign policy that such a development would take place. In fact, there are grave doubts that has happened or will happen now or in the near future. The problem was, and the problem remains, that Russia is a country which is susceptible to ideas. That in itself is a positive thing. But inevitably, there's a tendency in Russia to choose the wrong ideas. The wrong ideas, as we know, were chosen in 1917, with the result that a system of enslavement was put in place in Russia, which lasted until 1991. But in 1991, when Russia embarked on a new path, and in fact was in a position to break with its previous tradition, there was again a problem of choosing the wrong ideas. It was held by the young reformers, so-called, who enjoyed unstinting support in the United States, that all that was really necessary was to take the property that had been put in public hands and put it in the hands of private owners, and that a law-based democracy would emerge automatically. This was a form of economic determinism which was unconsciously inherited from the communist regime. The fact is, as many of you know, or at least some of you may know if you've bothered to read Marxist philosophy, that Marx held that in order to have a socialist state, it was necessary to socialize the means of production. If property was in the hands of the state, you had socialism. And if you had socialism, you had everything else. You had an end to class conflict, you had perfect equality, you had unlimited wealth. It's ironic that the young reformers who prided themselves on being ardent enemies of communism, in attempting to dismantle communism, preserved nonetheless communism's principal philosophical principle, the idea that it's the economic system which determines the structure of law and morality in society, rather than the other way around. And they single-mindedly began to pursue the creation of capitalism in Russia without law, without morals, and without a framework of mutual obligation, which is necessary for a population undergoing dramatic social change. The first part of the process was the marked by hyperinflation. In the Soviet Union, there was a system of administered prices. All prices were fixed. But as a result of the economic reforms instituted by Gorbachev in 1985, inflationary pressures built up in the Soviet economy. It was then the Soviet Union. Under conditions of fixed prices, inflation is reflected in the shortage of goods, and it was impossible to buy anything in Russia in the latter years of perestroika. It was possible to buy some things. The stores, for example, had cabbages, rotten potatoes, 3-year-old fish preserves, and other things that people wouldn't buy if they had any choice. But any desirable consumer items, and including the most essential, were not available. And the result was that money that people had earned accumulated in savings accounts. In 1992, January 2nd, prices were released in Russia. Given the amount of pent-up inflation in the Russian economy, prices skyrocketed, with the result that the life savings of virtually the entire population was destroyed. People who had saved money for years to buy an apartment, a car, to pay for a wedding, to pay for a funeral, found that they had nothing left, that their savings was reduced to ashes. What had once been enough to buy an apartment in 3-4 weeks was enough to buy a pair of boots. And the result was that many people simply were left in a helpless situation. I was living in Russia during that period, and one night there was a knock on the door of my apartment, and a woman said that we're collecting money for the funeral of a neighbor in the building. People literally had no money to be buried. I, of course, contributed. But this was a reflection of the state of Russia in 1992 in the wake of the release of prices and the hyperinflation, which wiped out the savings of an entire generation and destroyed the base of mass support that had existed in Russia for the economic reforms. Not everyone in Russia, however, was impoverished by the hyperinflation. Those who had made money in the black market, those who had succeeded in accumulating money and property as a result of the abuse of their official positions, and those who had become involved in criminal organizations were well placed to take advantage of the inflation and to invest their money continually in illegal but nonetheless immensely profitable currency exchanges and businesses which produced a high return because they could keep up with inflation. Thus, the first divide appeared in Russia between the ultra-rich and the crushingly poor. And that divide was to widen over the years of the reforms in Russia. The Russian leadership under the new reformers, aware of the massive discontent that was building up in the society, offered a scheme called voucher privatization. Every Russian citizen was entitled to a voucher, which, according to the young reformers, was good for 2 Volga automobiles and represented each citizen's share of Russian industry. In fact, the average Russian, after 73 years of socialism, had no idea what to do with this voucher. He didn't have a lot of experience in investing in stock markets, voucher funds, or anything else. And a series of mythical voucher funds appeared in Russia, which promised people huge returns on their money and produced very convincing advertisements which showed with complex graphs how people's vouchers would increase in value. People invested their money in these funds and were informed that a mythical board of directors somewhere had voted that all returns from the voucher fund had to be reinvested. In short, their money disappeared. Those people who set up these funds and those people who organized the purchase of vouchers on the street, oftentimes in exchange for bottles of vodka or even less, were then able to take their bags of vouchers, illegally acquired, and use them to buy up the first parts of Russian industry. Voucher privatization was followed by money privatization. In 1994, it was no longer possible to buy factories with vouchers, but you could buy them with money. But at this point, the nexus of cooperation between corrupt officials, the newly rich, and Russia's criminals was such that no fair competition for the purchase of Russia's industrial enterprises was possible. The auctions which existed and which were announced oftentimes were rigged in advance. The winner was predetermined with the help of the local property commission. In those cases where the winner was not predetermined, a persistent bidder who succeeded in buying an enterprise against the will of the local property committee and the criminal business group that was in one way or another predestined to acquire the enterprise often paid for his persistence with his life. Finally, in late '95, this system had become more or less institutionalized. The rest of the world became aware of the Russian oligarchs. These were people who had succeeded in buying up Russian industry, using their connections and their wealth to buy public officials, in effect to privatize the government. It was commonly understood that the most important starting capital for any Russian enterprise was a purchased official, because that purchased official could deliver the permission which allowed a businessman to make windfall profits. With those profits, it was possible to buy more officials, and with the profits which accrued as a result of the subsequent purchases, possible to buy even more officials. So the result was that the government, by 1995, in many respects belonged to the super wealthy oligarchs that it itself had created. And this set the stage for what was called the Loans for Shares program. The one flaw in this oligarchic system was that it faced elections. And in 1996, Yeltsin faced elections, and his popularity rating was only 7%. There was widespread fear that the communists would benefit from the anger on the part of the population over the pillaging of the country, and that Gennady Zyuganov, the head of the Communist Party in Russia, would be elected the new president. What happened was that an agreement was reached between the newly minted oligarchs and the Yeltsin government. According to this agreement, the oligarchs would lend money to the cash-strapped government, cash-strapped because of the effect of massive corruption on the state revenues, and in return, the government would mortgage the crown jewels of Russian industry to those who made the loans. If the government was unable to pay on the loans, and it was 100% certainty that they wouldn't, the industrial enterprises would pass into the hands of the oligarchs. And that's exactly what happened. The oligarchs who won the bidding were the people who organized the bidding. The government put in charge of the bidding the very people who were most interested in acquiring the object being bid upon. And the result was that a huge percentage of Russian industry fell into the hands of a very, very small group of people. And it's now true that in Russia, Russia has many of the wealthiest people in the world, although it's an impoverished country. And a large percentage, according to some estimates 85% of the Russian economy, is one way or another controlled by a small group of Russian magnates, none of whom had any previous economic experience, none of whom created anything new, all of whom were successful in dividing up what already existed. The result for Russia itself was catastrophic. The the Russian industrial production was cut in half. The death rate in Russia soared. The figures for mortality in Russia were so frightening and so unbelievable that Western demographers, when they saw the spiraling increase in the rate of death in Russia, did not believe them at first. They thought there had been a mistake, only to find that the epidemic of heart attacks, strokes, murder, suicide, and fatal accidents was not a mistake, that it was in fact a real reflection of the spiritual, economic, and political crisis which was affecting the country. In any case, the Russian people, afflicted with this situation, turned once and for all against Yeltsin. In 1996, the flow of money from the oligarchs and a scare campaign directed against the communists, not that the communists didn't deserve to be campaigned against, but the nature of the campaign was intended to play on people's fears and to induce them to overlook the abuses of the Yeltsin government, had the effect of getting Yeltsin elected in 1996. But as the situation continued to get worse, it was clear to everyone that there was no hope that he or his hand-picked successor was going to be elected in 2000. In 1998, an opinion poll showed 2% of the population supported Yeltsin. 2%. Now, in fact, it's well known that in any opinion poll, 6% of the respondents don't understand the question. So the 2% who supported Yeltsin is not only not an impressive figure, but it raises the possibility that no one in the country actually supported him. And the result was a wave of panic in the Yeltsin leadership. The situation was made worse by the appointment of Yevgeny Primakov as prime minister to Yeltsin in the wake of an unsuccessful attempt to impeach Yeltsin. And Primakov, who enjoyed at least the grudging approval of the communists and the left wing in Russia, encouraged an investigation by a man named Yuri Skaratov, the prosecutor general, into the corruption of the Yeltsin era. Skaratov said, as he proceeded in his investigation, that there's not a single person in the Yeltsin leadership who isn't guilty of some crime. That might seem like an exaggeration to people here, but I can tell you it was no exaggeration. In fact, it was an understatement. He could have gone into all the crimes that they were guilty of. But he did something more than just rhetorically deal with the problem. He also began seriously to investigate two of the most vulnerable and prominent members of the Yeltsin entourage, Boris Berezovsky and Pavel Borodin. Berezovsky is a car dealer and who was close to Yeltsin's family, who accumulated enormous wealth, most of it illegal. Pavel Borodin was the head of the Kremlin Property Commission. He controlled and rented out and administered all of the government's property holdings in Russia and abroad, and that was worth billions of dollars. Both of them were under investigation in Switzerland as well as elsewhere. And this investigation threatened to unravel the whole skein of corruption which had impoverished the country and had created a system of oligarchical power in Russia and entrenched a group that was allied with criminals at the highest levels of state power. However, Yuri Skaratov had the bad judgment to meet a couple of prostitutes in a banya. This is a Russian bath that was run by one of Russia's largest criminal organizations, the Solntsev gang, where he was photographed, and the film was shown on Russian television, prime time, with a brief warning that this is not suitable for children, which of course stopped no one from watching it. Did not interfere with anyone from watching what happened. And in the aftermath of this political pornography, Skuratov was removed. The person in charge of the operation for the removal of Skuratov was a little known, at that time, completely unknown head of the KGB, or FSB, the successor organization to the KGB, named Vladimir Putin. A guy no one had ever heard of or ever imagined could ever amount to anything in Russia. But he had obviously recommended himself with this operation because more was to be heard of him later. There began to be rumors in Moscow that something terrible was going to happen to save the Russian oligarchy and the Yeltsin oligarchy. The rumors were various, that there would be terrorist acts, that there would be riots. No one was quite sure what. But in August of 1999, there was an explosion in the Manege shopping center, which some of you may know is near the Kremlin. It's an underground shopping center. One person was killed. There was a haunting and inexplicable invasion by a group of Islamic extremists from Chechnya of the neighboring province of Dagestan. This was treated as aggression against Russia because at that time Chechnya had won at least a provisional independence from Russia. But there were many puzzling things about this invasion. For one thing, the border guards who normally guarded the border between Chechnya and Dagestan shortly before the invasion were removed. Secondly, the Russian army and air force made no effort to stop the invaders. They were beaten back by the local police. And when they left Dagestan after this so-called invasion, no one tried to pursue them. They left in columns of trucks, and there was no effort on the part of the Russian garrison in the area to stop them, harass them, interdict them in any way. All of which gave rise to the possibility that this invasion had been staged in order to provide a pretext for an invasion of Chechnya. But a terrorist act in Moscow in which one person is killed and a comic opera invasion of Dagestan, which is over in a couple of weeks, would not have been enough to rally the Russian people behind a new war in Chechnya. But what happened next definitely did. Beginning in early September, apartment buildings were blown up in the middle of the night in Russian cities, killing all of the inhabitants. The climax took place in Moscow with the blowing up of the apartment buildings on Guryanova Street and the Kashirskaya Chaussee. Hundreds of people were killed, men, women, and children, blown to bits, crushed under the falling masonry and bricks while they slept. And the result was that the Russian public was galvanized behind a new war in Chechnya. Vladimir Putin, who days before had been named the new prime minister, took charge of this new war, and at first it went well, largely because the northern part of Chechnya is a plain up to the Terek River. No real resistance against a regular army is possible in the event of an invasion of that area. And for a Russian public weary of impoverishment, frustrated by the hardships of life, xenophobic, resentful of the loss of power, angry at the Chechens for the defeat that they administered to the Russians in 1996, a perfect foil was created for all of the frustration that had built up in Russia. And the anger that had been directed against the Yeltsin entourage was redirected against the Chechens. And Vladimir Putin, whom no one had ever heard of, who had never run for office, who is totally unprepossessing, and whose entire career virtually had been spent in the security services, became a national hero overnight. The result was that his popularity went up 20%, 30%, 40%. Yeltsin resigned in the end of December 1999, and Putin became the acting president. That meant there were 3 months to hold new presidential elections. During those 3 months, the war in Chechnya was still going relatively well. Putin was reelected, and his first official act was to issue a pardon for Yeltsin and the members of his family for all crimes committed during his time in office. And that pardon was extremely sweeping. It protected Yeltsin against searches of his home, his telephone records, his car, his apartment, and extended the same protection to his relatives, who were in fact the core of corruption in Russia. And Putin was welcomed as a great leader in the West, and the Russian people themselves reacted positively to his decisiveness, or his appearance of decisiveness, and all would have been very successful had it not been for one mistake. As often happens in life, nothing is carried out perfectly, and that was the case with what I think was the conspiracy to put a hand-picked successor to Yeltsin into power and to preserve the division of property. Because there was another bombing, and that was in the city of Ryazan. There was another bomb, and that was placed in the basement of an apartment building in Ryazan. But this bomb didn't go off. An attentive resident of the building saw people doing something suspicious. And with the whole country in a state of terror over the bombing of apartment buildings, he called the police. The police did not want to come. He insisted. They came. He forced them to go down into the basement, which local drunks had used as a toilet. Police didn't want to go down there. Then this resident of the building he and his daughter forced them to go down there. They went down into the basement, bolted up the steps, and said there's a bomb in there, and evacuated the building, the neighboring buildings, and finally the entire district. Thousands of people were out on the street. The bomb squad in Ryazan went down into the building, tested it, and tested the materials, which tested positive for hexagon, the explosive used in all the other bombings. The bomb experts also identified the detonator. It was a real live military detonator capable of detonating the bomb and destroying the building. Not only that, the building was built on a hill, and had the bomb gone off, the force of the explosion would have obliterated the building. The building would have hit the next building down the slope with the force of an avalanche and taken it out too. As a result, the casualties would have been more terrible than for all of the previous bombings combined. Immediately, a dragnet was announced for Ryazan. The city was literally sealed off. All roads were closed. Airport was closed. Train stations were closed. All the police were called up. There were announcements on all the media because there was a description of the 3 people who had placed the bomb. And sometime during that day, a telephone call was made from the interurban telephone station, and an attentive phone operator listened in on the call. I said that this is an old Russian habit, but my wife, who's Russian, doesn't like that, so I won't say that that's a Russian habit. I'll say that that's a tendency of anyone under circumstances in which people are panicked. She listened to the call, and the caller said, "They've got the city surrounded. How do we get out of here?" The voice on the other line said, "Split up and get out any way you can." She traced the call and gave the number to the local police. They checked the number, expecting it to be the number of Chechen terrorists. It was the number of the FSB. Not long after that, the 3 terrorists were arrested. They produced FSB identification. It was now clear that the failed bombing could not be attributed to Chechens anymore. And Nikolai Patrushev, the head of the FSB, got on national television and said, congratulations to the residents of Ryazan. This was a test of vigilance, and you did brilliantly. Now, actually, I want to take my book and read to you the most appropriate, what I feel are the most appropriate way to react to that claim, which is this. One can't believe impossible things. I dare say you haven't had much practice, said the Queen. When I was your age, I always did it for half an hour a day. Why, sometimes I believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. That's from Alice in Wonderland. And if you want to believe 6 impossible things before breakfast, you can believe that that was a training exercise in a country which was already in a state of total terror, and in which the false calls about bombs were coming in by the dozens all over the country. But if it wasn't a training exercise, what was it? Because if it was an attempt to blow up the building, and if it was the FSB that was responsible for doing so, and if the modus operandi is exactly the same as that was used in the buildings that were blown up, that suggests that it was the FSB, which is, generally speaking, a blunt instrument for those who are in power, that was responsible for the terrorist act that killed 300 Russians as they slept and served as the justification for the Second Chechen War, a war which has caused thousands of deaths and is still going on. The book that I wrote attempts to describe this history, and it attempts to show the consequences for Russia of choosing that wrong idea once again, i.e., that you can transform economic structures and you can create a democratic society without the benefit of a framework of law or morality. It's a misapprehension which is common to the modern age, because we all forget oftentimes the invisible framework of morality which was bequeathed to us by our political system, founded centuries ago by people influenced by the Enlightenment. In a country like Russia, which didn't have that historical experience, we all too often assume that the same framework of morality and law exists there that exists here or exists in the West, when in reality it's precisely that has to be created. It was the mistake, I think, of policymakers in the United States to ignore this fundamental aspect of Russian reform. And the consequences for Russia now are that the country faces a very uncertain future, because under these circumstances, insofar as it was the FSB which apparently saved the oligarchy, it is now the FSB which dominates the Russian system. And the FSB, the inheritor to the KGB, which was responsible for such terror in Russia, cannot be the agent of democratization in Russian society. As a result, the future of Russia once again is in question. And once again, Russia faces the same dilemma that it has faced throughout its modern history, which is, where is the source of values? Is the source of values in the economic system? Is there any economic system which in and of itself can generate values? Or does an economic system by its nature require the guidance of values? I think it was the false answer to that question which created the present criminal ascendancy in Russia and makes Russia a danger not only to itself, but to the rest of the world as well, because its instability could ultimately threaten us. And it's this realization that it needs to be brought home to Russians and Americans, and is in reality, I think, the only real hope for Russia's future resurrection. And with that, I will close these extended remarks, and and answer your questions, if you have any.
I'd like to point out that there's seats available
Yeah, everyone is standing
if
back
you
there.
would raise your hand if you have an empty seat next to you, people can come up and take seats. There's seats in the front row, there's seats all along here. If you want to sit down, don't have to sit down. And we're going to ask people who want to ask questions to please use the speaker's mic right here. It was a marvelous presentation, David. It held us all in thrall. And I'm sure there are lots of questions.
There are also seats here, and there are all
There's still
there's
seats
so many
in
people
front.
standing.
Still seats in front.
There's no.
Okay.
All right, we won't do what Hans Morgenthau used to do when I was a student. Force people to come up. Yeah.
Use the mic, please.
I'm all for a sense of values and all that sort of thing, and I think it does have a very clear role. But there's also the issue of laws, and the not working?
There you go.
It's the question of the competitiveness and the permission to be competitive, and the laws that allow competition, as well as the system of values. So I think there's both the legal side and the innate values that go behind it.
Well, did everyone hear the question? Do you mind if I repeat your question? The questioner was saying that there's the question of values, but there's also the question of law that regulates competition and that makes it possible for there to be competition. But I think the real question then is, what is the source of law? The source of law is values. And in fact, the law replicates in its application and in its existence the religious values of the West, because the equality of the citizens before the law is simply a reproduction of the supposed equality of believers before God. The system of law, which presumes that equality, incarnates, in fact, the presumption of the Western religious moral tradition that all are equal before God. And so when we talk about the laws that regulate competition, we are talking about the influence via those laws of values in the society. And it's only when you think that the economic system established on its own is capable of generating the practices independent of any moral agency that will control its functioning, that you create monsters like the Soviet Union or the criminal ascendancy that exists in Russia today.
Could you please use the mic? It's right behind you. Anybody, line up at the mic if you want to ask a question.
What's your solution?
Well, yeah, this is a very American question, but for the sake of all who wanted to ask the same question, I'll try to answer it. The solution is the creation in Russia of a critical mass in the population that is determined to organize politically and recognize the importance of doing away once and for all with the criminals who have taken over the country. That may seem difficult. In fact, it's not. There's abundant information on the criminal activities of all of the leading Russian oligarchs. Partially, this is because law enforcement has collected this information and it sits there not acted upon. But also it's the fact that each of the oligarchs has been very busy collecting information on the others, and has made it and is more than willing to make this information available to law enforcement. Russia faces a systemic crisis. The population is declining, and declining catastrophically, and no one should be fooled by the appearance of relative economic well-being. This is tied to the price of oil. If the price of oil falls, Russia will quickly slip into economic crisis. Under these circumstances, and given the fact that this is a country with the lowest male life expectancy in the industrial world, there are enormous pressures on the society to take its fate in its own hands. It can only be done politically. But it's important to bear in mind that there's a real political vacuum in Russia that an honest person could well fill. And as long as there are semi-democratic institutions, and as long as there is awareness, and that the point about awareness is very important, there's a chance that Russia, through its own devices, can establish the type of democracy and make the type of changes which will allow the country to breathe, free it from the yoke of those who are strangling it, in fact, and make it possible for the country to have a better future. But one of the role that the United States and the West can play in all this, and since we are not direct actors, is by making it clear to the Russians that we understand the nature of the problem and by elucidating it ourselves. In this respect, my greatest hope is that what I've written will make a difference, because it is going to be published very soon in Russia. And when I was one of the people who's read Darkness at Dawn is Grigory Yavlinsky. He's the head of a political party in Russia who intends to use the book in the election campaign for the Russian parliament in December. In any case, the truth shall make you free, and awareness and political organization on the part of the population could well provide the preconditions for doing something about the egregious conditions that exist there, and dealing with with bringing justice to the victims of the terror bombings of 1999, which were as traumatic for Russia as September 11th was for us. We had the benefit of being victims of bombings carried out not by our own government. It will be, of course, much more traumatic in Russia if the truth leads to the Russian government. But it's a truth that needs to be told. Yeah.
My name is Nikolai Zimin. I'm afraid doesn't... left one is working. My name is Nikolai Zimin. I am correspondent for Russian weekly magazine Itogi.
Ah, yeah.
And first, I have to make a very short comment. Among Russians, so-called oligarchs, the term was first employed by Mr. Chubais, was at least one who created something. I mean Mr. Gusinsky with his NTV and newspaper Сегодня, magazine Itogi, and TV program 7 Days. But I would like to hear from you the comment about very funny situations, which somehow is related to the subject of your book. I'm sure you remember this noisy scandal about New York Bank. During, I think, 6 months, all newspapers, including Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Financial Times, were filled with the new revelations about money laundering from Russia. And there were 2 very small trials, and 3 people was given some kind of jail. But it was so unprecedentedly quiet when in the beginning of this year, those scandal was closed. The Manhattan attorney closed the deal, and nobody, excluding the information agencies, some information agencies, presented this fact. So I would like to hear your comment about this, disproportionals.
The coverage?
Yes. Thank
Well,
you.
first of all, I stand corrected. Gusinsky did create something, and in light of all the money that he managed to appropriate without creating, it's good he did create something. And NTV was certainly worth creating. Not to mention Itogi, also worth creating. As far as the Bank of New York scandal, after it surfaced, I have to confess to you that I didn't follow its further development. I know that the prosecution of the case petered out for whatever reason. But the fact that without, I do cite in the book, and I do know of other cases in which promising investigations petered out because of a lack of cooperation from the Russian authorities. I don't know if that's the case in the Bank of New York scandal. I haven't followed the latest developments in it. But whether that scandal was overblown or not, the fact of illegal capital export and money laundering in Russia is undeniable. And I wouldn't want to draw too broad a conclusion from the fate of that one scandal, especially when I haven't seen the conclusions of the prosecutor. The Ministry of Internal Affairs in Russia estimated that the amount of capital illegally removed from Russia was close to $200 billion in the reform period. So whether the $4 billion in the case of the Bank of New York was overblown or not, the phenomenon exists. Yeah.
Mr. Satter, what you describe is just absolutely awful. You know, far worse than anything that I had imagined, and I think I read the paper fairly closely, as probably many people do, and such a despotic criminal state. And it's, you know, it's not just a matter of unfairness. I mean, this is a matter of, I've seen some of the life expectancy figures too, and it's absolutely horrible and awful. And if there was any kind of government there, they would attend to this incredible public health crisis that's going on. Now, what about, and your title too, I mean, Darkness at Dawn, you know, it's been snuffed out even before it began. As far as I can tell in my studying of Russian history, reading of Russian history, and Soviet history, you know, if we're just looking at the 20th century, the people that have gotten to power, you know, a few Mensheviks in 1917, and maybe Mikhail Gorbachev, which I don't know, maybe you could, you know, shatter our illusions about him, but at least, you know, he was a communist, but at least he seemed to be of some, you know, reformist, you know, mode.
No, unquestionably.
You know, where is the history? Where is the, who has ever, where is the basis for hope in this society with all of these tremendous needs?
Well, first of all, I don't agree that Russia is despotic at the present time. It's corrupt, it's dangerous, it's a country which faces a systemic crisis. But in fact, compared to the Soviet Union, it's important to bear in mind, Russia is relatively free. And it does have some very worthwhile institutions. I mean, the mere fact that a book like this can be published in Russia, that tells you something, just in and of itself. But it's a different kind of misgovernment and oppression. It's a government that's not so much concerned with total political control and turning people into zombies the way the communists were. It just doesn't want to be challenged so that the people around the government will be free to enrich themselves at the expense of everyone else. But the deeper question of Russia's fate and why Russia consistently turns out bad leaders and bad governments, as far as Gorbachev is concerned, he was no angel, but of course he perhaps inadvertently played an enormously positive historical role. It's a part of the misconception in Russia that's shared really around the world by various people, that it's possible to find values from something other than a genuinely transcendent source. Religious and political power in Russia were so amalgamated, the state was so deified, and its prerogatives so deified, that individuals were degraded. In fact, any time a system absolutizes itself, individuals become interchangeable. And the deification in the state in Russia, the degradation of the individual, created a situation in which people couldn't imagine values which transcended the state and to which the state was also subject. And that tradition The idea that the individual human being, compared to the wielders of power, is worth nothing, and that his life is worth nothing, that persists. And Russia will have one of the chapters in the book is the value of human life. And Russia will not move forward, will not be able to save itself until that conception of the individual is changed, until people understand that the individual does have value. There's one incident in the...
That's the inheritance of the longevity of serfdom.
Well, serfdom was one reflection of it, but there were many factors. This was the inheritance of Byzantium and the Mongol domination of Russia. Serfdom actually postdated some of this development. But in any case, there's one incident in the book about a little boy who was killed in a motor accident when Putin's motorcade drove into a lane of oncoming traffic outside of Moscow, hit the car in which the little boy was riding, and then he was killed. And there was no justice for that child, and no justice for the family. And the Putin's hangers-on tried to cover it all up. Now, Putin himself was not driving the car, so it was his driver who was responsible. But his driver was protected. And it's absolutely common for Russian leaders at various ranks to kill people with their crazy driving habits because they don't see those people as having lives that ought to be protected. And they're worth something. And this psychology is reflected, I believe, in what happened in Moscow in 1999. After all, it's very possible to imagine the logic of someone who treats individuals as having no importance, as saying, well, okay, 300 people or 800 people will be blown up, but our hold on power will be preserved. That's how the Bolsheviks thought. And that strain of thinking hasn't disappeared from Russia. Is anyone else? Yeah.
I have two which one? This?
Yeah, probably both of them.
Both of them. Okay, I have two questions. First question, given the Soviet-Russian history and Soviet history, and especially Brezhnev's era, do you foresee the possibility of other developments, in 90s, after Yeltsin's coming to power, the other way of developing the situation? And the second question you describe very vividly, and I completely agree with your description of collapse of structures of government, law, and power in Russia in 90s. And don't you see that basically that FSB or KGB former, it was basically the only stabilizing power that left in the society at this time? And I also agree that probably it was participating in crimes you mentioned, but on the other hand, what other force you could see in Russia capable of maintaining the state, basically? Thank you.
I may have to repeat your question. I'm not sure everyone heard you. If they did not, tell me, I'll try to paraphrase what you said. I think the first is, could there have been another development aside from the Yeltsin evolution during the 1990s? And was not the KGB, for all its faults, a stabilizing factor in Russia? And one of the few structures capable of exerting a stabilizing influence. Is that okay? Is that, more or less right? Well, let's take the second question first. The FSB, which is the organization which succeeded the KGB, cannot be a stabilizing influence in Russia because more and more it's involved in Russia's criminal activities. The FSB now has a whole network of private security organizations which offer protection to business at a price. That means that they, in addition to other Russian law enforcement organizations, have gone into the protection racket. And they're treating protection and extortion as a normal part of life. The only thing that can stabilize the situation in Russia is the rule of law. And the fact that a bunch of enforcers have exist and work hand in glove with the corrupt holders of wealth can't be a stabilizing factor in the society. Only if those enforcers are enforcing something that's reasonable and that is the impartial application of the law, which they're not doing. And certainly they're not doing, if my suspicions are correct about the terrorist acts of 1999. Now, as far as could the Yeltsin evolution have been different? I think there are two questions there. First of all, could Yeltsin have been different? And second of all, could there have been someone other than Yeltsin? Yeltsin was certainly influenced enormously by the United States and by the West. If the advice had been better, could he have been better? Possibly. He was not an experienced international politician. Could someone else have emerged as Russian leader during that period? Well, that goes back to the question of the perestroika years. And as it happened, Andrei Sakharov died in 1989 of a heart attack. Had Sakharov lived, he would not have been president of Russia, unfortunately. But he would have had great influence. And under those circumstances, perhaps it might have been someone different than Yeltsin, someone more worthy. Maybe even someone like Alexander Yakovlev. But that's historical speculation.
This will be their last question. Pull the mic a little bit down towards you, the other one. Yeah.
Is that it?
Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Sadler, by very gracious fortune, the Fulbright scholars are going to be sent to Russia this year. They with perhaps some concern and anxiety that they wouldn't be. Thank you. I'll be going to St. Petersburg next March to May. As I said to you before, I'm terrorized of going, and I'll tell you what I'm anxious about. And I'd like to find out what your advice is about how I can be a better ambassador, informal ambassador, just as your book is a kind of ambassadorship too, I think. I'm, yes, very concerned about the criminal element and what that means, but more importantly, I'm afraid I'm going to get overwhelmingly depressed there if there's a sense of hopelessness or a sense of hysteria. So what has been your experience, and what can I do?
Well, as far as your personal experience is concerned, I think you'll probably have a great personal experience in Russia, because Russia's full of interesting people. They are very hospitable and very friendly, and despite the government's anti-Americanism at the present, they like Americans and are very tolerant, and I think that you'll have a great time in that respect. If you don't wish to, you can ignore the conditions in Russia and associate with people who will not remind you, whose way of life will not remind you of the hardships of the hardships the society is going through. So if you want to be well informed as well as to have a good time, then it's up to you really to ask people what's going on and to try to look beneath the surface of events there. This is a big problem for a lot of Western observers, that they don't do that. And Russians are not going to just tell you everything about their lives and about the lives of others. You have to take an active interest. But if you do that, you'll be rewarded for, first of all, intellectually, insofar as you'll understand the country better, and second of all, I think you'll be rewarded by the respect of your Russian interlocutors, who both like and admire Westerners who really try to understand what is going on in the country and take it as a sign of respect. So I would not be afraid, and I would just go there with the anticipation that you'll meet lots of interesting people, and with the determination to take advantage of their knowledge so that you can be better informed and can tell people back here about what's really going on in that great country.
Thank you so much for.
Thank you all. Thank you all for coming. Thank you. Oh, wow.
I ask you to.
David Satter is a research fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Darkness at Dawn is published by Yale University Press, on the web at yalebooks.com.